Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Paige, for that introduction. I'm happy to see all of you here in Remus, and welcome to those of you who are joining us online as well. So this week, I'm here to tell you about the other half of the equation in our exhibition on view in the Gund Gallery. You heard about O'Keeffe last week from my co-curator, Erica Hirschler, and today we'll dive into Henry Moore. Through this talk, we'll explore together the life and work of one of the leading British artists of the 20th century. By the end of this hour, I hope that those of you who did know Moore will come to know a bit more about him, and for those of you who didn't know him, you'll be encouraged to go down to the Gund Gallery and see his works in person. We'll start at the beginning. Moore was born in Castleford, Yorkshire on July 30th, 1898, and he was the son of a miner. He completed a teacher training course in 1915 at the Castleford Secondary School. And after the outbreak of World War I in 1914, he enlisted in the Civil Service Rifles in 1916 and was ultimately injured in a gas attack in France in 1918 and returned home shortly after peace was declared. I'm showing you here a sweet photo of him when he was only 12 and then there with his battalion. Off the back of the war, he received an ex-serviceman's grant for further study, and he secured a place at the Leeds College of Art in 1919. And the following year there at Leeds, he began to study sculpture, where he was the first student in that medium, the first and only one at that time. Eventually, fellow Yorkshire art student Barbara Hepworth would also join the Leeds program, and the two would meet and intersect throughout their lives and careers, and we'll hear a bit more about Hepworth later on. This carving in sycamore wood is one of the earliest known sculptures by Moore, undertaken when he was still a student at the Leeds College of Art. It demonstrates Moore's interest in African art and an early experimentation with carving. Throughout his life, he drew inspiration from a wide range of sources. He was omnivorous in his interests in art and art history. In 1924, so not long after he was beginning his training, he exhibited at Redfern Gallery in London in his first group exhibition, alongside fellow students that were then at the Royal College of Art in London, including Hepworth and others. He displayed 3 sculptures, including this very tender work of a dog that I'm showing you here, which reflects his interest in direct carving, which was an approach to making sculpture where the actual process of carving suggests the final form rather than a carefully worked out preliminary model. And this had really been introduced by the great sculptor Brancusi a little bit earlier in the 20th century and championed by artists active in Britain like the American-born Jacob Epstein, who was exhibiting in London around the time of Moore's formative years there. After that first exhibition, he received a scholarship to travel to Italy, as all great artists do, and he went there in 1925, where he saw works by the ancient artists, as well as Renaissance Baroque painters and sculptors. Carving remains a key part of his work throughout his career, even as he begins to work in other materials. I'm showing you here the beautiful work from the early 1930s that's in the exhibition downstairs in a very lovely local English alabaster, where he's kind of found the form of a woman within the stone and brought it out with small details, the little lines for the fingers that you see at the front and the small rounds for the eyes. And there's a photo of him directly carving there for you from the late 1920s. Successes came relatively quickly because by 1928, he was already having his first solo exhibition at the Warren Gallery in London. He again showed carved works similar to the dog that I showed you before, but he began incorporating works made in concrete, which was a material primarily used in architecture at that time. And here we begin to start to see some of the themes of his work that we'll see throughout the rest of his working practice for the next 6 decades, including reclining figures like this one and mother and child groups. And we'll see a few of those as we look through works by him together. Such as this work here, which comes at a time when he was experimenting using local stones, such as this green Horton stone here. Horton stone, a type of limestone, could come from quarries near Oxford, and it was a particular favorite of his. It came in a tawny brown color, as well as a more green and bluish hue, like this work here. And you can see that this work is still quite figural. His work oscillates between figural and abstract throughout his whole career. In 1929, he married Irina Radetzky, a painting student at Leeds, and together they moved to Hampstead in North London, a community where a lot of artists and writers lived, and they had a home there, and Moore had a small studio. And here is a drawing that Moore did in 1930, just when they were newlyweds, and this is on view in the exhibition. Apparently at this time, Irina liked to wear her hair in a low bun at the back of her head, which appears in the drawing as this darker wash that you can see, kind of in shadow. And you'll see as we look at his figures that a lot of them have almost accretion-like pieces on the back of their heads, and it all stems back to how Irina used to wear her hair when they were first married. During this time in the late 1920s and early 1930s, Moore was also teaching part-time at the Royal College of Art and the Chelsea School of Art in London, and he continues teaching there until war breaks out and puts an end to those programs. Since we're in the final weeks of the Dali exhibition upstairs in the Torf Gallery, curated by my colleagues in the Art of Europe department, Julia Welch and Frederick Ilchman, I thought I'd include this little moment from 1936. This is the International Surrealist exhibition at the New Burlington Galleries in London. Moore was on the organizing committee for the exhibition, and he exhibited 4 sculptures and 3 drawings. I'm showing you there his little figure in travertine that you can see in the box there. Dali was also involved and was meant to be giving a lecture one of the days during the run of the exhibition, and Moore later recalled about that, quote, "I remember going to a surrealist meeting at which Salvador Dali was the speaker. We sat there for about 25 minutes or so and nothing happened, just an empty stage. Everyone was getting fed up and starting to leave when suddenly there was an enormous bang and a great puff of smoke, and as it cleared, there was Dali standing in a diver's suit with a diving helmet, giving his lecture. Anything for publicity." And Dali ultimately got stuck in that helmet and had to be removed using a wrench. The 1930s continued to bring success for Moore, including another solo exhibition in London at the Leicester Galleries, and the Museum für Kunst und Gewerbe in Hamburg in Germany acquired the first work by Moore for a museum, a limestone head, which is now lost. And at this point, he's appointed head of sculpture at the Chelsea School of Art and remains in that position until the end of the 1930s. And at this time, Herbert Reed, an art critic and art historian, publishes the first monograph on Moore, and Reed and Moore would continue to share a special relationship throughout their life. He remains his biographer and really a champion of Moore's work through the 1940s and 50s. But it's really the war years where Moore comes to increasing prominence, certainly within the London art scene. During the Blitz in the fall of 1940, approximately 100,000 of London's residents took shelter in the underground stations, hoping to escape the bombings that were happening above ground that continued for 57 consecutive nights. Moore visited the tunnels and took note of what he saw, but out of respect for the people there, he did not sketch while he was there. The following year, he turned his notes into small studies and larger drawings. With figures huddled together in curving tunnel, these works were among his most haunting, evocative, and memorable, and they served as inspiration for his sculptures for years to come, long after the war ended. And off of the back of these works, which were made by him of his own volition, he was appointed an official war artist after he showed these drawings publicly to his friend and influential art critic, Kenneth Clark, who chaired the War Artists Advisory Committee. And for the work on the right here, he used a drawing technique where he would apply wax crayon over a composition loosely drawn in pencil, on top of which he then applied watercolor. And Moore said about this, "It was a sort of magic to see the watercolor run off of those parts that had the surface of wax. The ghostly figures and white accents on the wall then just become visible when the watercolor was applied, so a kind of revealing of form and space in these tunnels." Moore made over 9,000 drawings in his long career, and they played a significant role in his artistic practice. allowing him to consider how forms related to one another and to the space around them. In particular, the figures that he saw and drew against dark walls during the war served as a point of inspiration for many years. This sculpture in the MFA's collection, with a single female figure silhouetted against a curved wall, was part of the planning and design process for a commission for a large sculpture at the UNESCO headquarters in Paris a decade and a half later. And it still shows how sort of visceral the memory was at the time for Moore, and we'll look a little bit more in depth at that commission later. And in the meantime, you can look at this work on view in our Gallery 153 on the ground floor of the Evans Wing, where we've installed it in our permanent collection galleries alongside the exhibition in the Gund Gallery. So during the war, his street in Hampstead was bombed and his studio was damaged. And he and his wife, Irina, decided to retreat a bit and rented a property outside of London to the northeast in a hamlet called Much Haddam in the county of Hertfordshire. And they later ultimately purchased the house, which is called Perry Green. It's about 27 miles northeast of London, nestled in a rolling green countryside full of sheep fields. And while in some ways this is a rural setting, Moore was not remote, and certainly was not as far away from the hustle and bustle as O'Keeffe was when she went to New Mexico. He continued to visit London weekly to meet with dealers and patrons, and he hosted many people at his home and his studio throughout his life. He would make this property his home until his death in 1986, developing numerous workshops on the property and using the fields and landscapes in his artistic practice and entertaining visitors, including fellow artists, heads of state, and potential patrons at his home. Since a large part of his practice involved making large-scale sculptures, he also had a number of studio assistants throughout his career, most notably the sculptor Anthony Caro. As part of the planning for this exhibition, we had a chance to visit what is now the Henry Moore Foundation, and it helped us hugely in terms of getting to know both Moore as an artist, but also to be able to create the lively and realistic studio display that's on view in the exhibition downstairs. The studio that we recreated in the exhibition was his Bourne Maquette studio that he used for making plasters from the 1970s onwards. And it was also the home for his collection of found objects, bones, stones, shells, flint, that were inspiration for his sculpture. Moore always said that he liked working in small scale, maquette size, because it allowed him to turn a form over and all around, something that he couldn't do with a full size or a finished work. He felt that if the proportions worked on the small scale, they would work when the form was enlarged as well. Beyond the windows of the somewhat cramped studio were beautiful rolling landscapes where he'd often take his sculptures and set them there to see how they interacted with space, with the trees, with the sky beyond. And he had a modular system of styrofoam blocks that he would place around the property to use as temporary bases for his sculpture, always seeing how they would change as they moved around. And I'm showing you this photo that I took when we were there. These fun colors on the back side of the studio wall were there so that when he took photographs of his sculpture, which were in black and white then, these would appear as if they were clouds, creating another kind of landscape that he could use inside the studio. And the white sculpture that I'm showing here is on a little turntable, which was something that he had in his studio spaces to allow him to picture and imagine a shape from all different angles. And here's an image of the studio recreation we have in the gallery, and you can see a smaller, similar turntable on the table in the center. We went for a very dense display here, packing more objects into this space, and also adding a video of Moore himself at work, handling some of the very objects that are on display. And I'll just give credit to our designer, Louisa Respondek, who really brought his studio and O'Keeffe's to life. But I think in particular, we knew that Moore's had to have all this sense of accumulation. And it was a lot of fun writing the labels for this because we had to write saucepan full of miscellaneous bits of plaster to identify that little piece that's on the floor by the table. And that's just what Moore's studio was like, full of things that served as a source for inspiration for him. And it's that idea of found objects playing a role in both the artistic practices of O'Keeffe and Moore that is central to the exhibition. As you saw in the studio photo, there was just so many things that he picked up and kept. Sometimes he'd take the objects like stones, shells, and add plasticine or clay to them to create new forms. Other times he would take a form and press it into clay or plaster to create a negative form of it, so finding the inverse. And here in this example, which I encourage you to see in the galleries, nature did a bit of the hard work for him. In the little object you can see in the case here, that is a bit of shell onto which coral has grown, and it's created this kind of curved shape with a line on it. And then Moore really liked this shape and used it to create the maquette here for his mother and child that's made in this amazing stalactite, which he sourced from then Czechoslovakia when he made it in the 1970s. And I think you can really see how it unfolds from found object to maquette and then to the full-scale work. And it changes quite a bit when it gets into this beautiful, luminous stone that almost seems to glow from within. One of his other spaces that we had a chance to visit, but which would have posed quite a challenge to recreate in Gund, was the plastic studio. When Moore wanted to work on large-scale sculpture outside, he needed natural light and an ability to work in all weather. So in the 1960s, he created his first plastic studio. It was a large metal structure, about 15 meters high, encased in corrugated plastic with sheets of polythene, which was accompanied by another studio on the side, about a third in size. And he needed this large space to work on monumental scale, while the smaller studio held the enlargement models. And it was designed to be temporary, this space. He set up multiple plastic studios throughout his lifetime. And you can see some of the large-scale works posed as if they're still underway. That's how the display is now. Another great benefit of our time at the Moore Foundation was getting to meet people who knew Moore. James Copper, who has been at the foundation as a conservator for 30 years, knew Moore when he himself was a boy. Copper was the godson of one of Moore's last studio assistants and used to enjoy climbing on the sculptures that he now takes care of. Some of you may have enjoyed his really evocative descriptions in the audio guide. And I think one of the best bits for me is how he talks about the way Moore's small-scale practice fed into his larger works. He said, and then once he'd finished, he could then hand these objects to the assistants who would cast them in plaster. And he would work on the surface, and this became the full-scale finished sculpture at that size. Moore would then hand these to the assistants to enlarge to the working size. Sometimes they stayed at working model size. That was his ultimate size. That's where he thought the sculpture was perfect. Sometimes they stayed at the maquette size because they thought they were perfect like that. And sometimes he would enlarge them to the final size, between 6 and 8 feet, sometimes even bigger. And I'm showing you here a sculpture that some of you might know from visiting London, the beloved arch in Kensington Gardens with its little tiny maquette. It's only about 3 inches tall, and this is huge. Multiple people could stand on top of each other underneath that. So really from the experience during the war, the shelter drawings did bring quite a bit more prominence to Moore's career. And off the back of that, I'd like to turn to the period where he becomes best known and is really most productive, from the mid-1940s until the 1980s. Moore's post-war success and influence was seen as a kind of model of humanism and of British cultural identity, which in a way translated very well to the international stage as the Cold War was starting to brew. His language of abstraction was one that resonated strongly in the post-war world, both at home and in an international context. And we learned last week in Erica's lecture about O'Keeffe's exhibition in 1946. Moore had one at MoMA in New York the same year, from December 1946 until March 1947. It was organized by the same curator, James Johnson Sweeney, and as Erica mentioned last week, his exhibition did get a catalog. The press release for the exhibition noted that it was, quote, the largest exhibition ever given in America for a living British artist. In addition to 60 pieces of sculpture in stone, wood, lead, bronze, and concrete, The exhibition includes approximately 50 drawings, half of them from the artist's famous Shelter series and 2 of his sculpture notebooks. So it would have been a very comprehensive collection of sculpture in a range of material and in almost equal proportion to his drawings, 60 to 50, with the Shelter drawings called out as something that had really put him specifically on the map. Following the MoMA show and a bit more international success, Moore was awarded the International Sculpture Prize at the Venice Biennale in 1948, where he represented Britain alongside Turner. The exhibition was quite a success, largely because of the ability of Moore's sculpture to transcend cultural and linguistic barriers. According to Herbert Reed, who we heard about earlier, who was part of the Venice Selection Committee, a big part of it was that the artist's common world language of form contributed to the exhibition's popularity. Moore himself said, quote, "For the 1948 Venice Biennale, the first after the war, the British Council decided to have just my sculpture and Turner paintings, which was a very sensible thing." At home in Britain in the first years of the 1950s, an event called the Festival of Britain was organized as a national exhibition and a fair, and it was largely located on the South Bank area in London. The exhibition, which coincided with the 100th anniversary of the Great Exhibition of 1851, was less an international World's Fair and more focused on the recovery of the country after the war. The fair sought to tell the story of British achievements in science and art, and to raise spirits and encourage a positive attitude about Britain. It attracted millions of visitors between May and September of 1951. Moore was approached by the Arts Council of Great Britain to create a sculpture for the festival. The committee requested a family group, something that Moore had made for other public settings in the decade prior, but Moore provided a reclining figure, which he described as, quote, "the first sculpture in which I succeeded in making form and space sculpturally inseparable." He wanted to provide a carving initially, but later decided that a bronze would be more suitable for an outdoor site. And I'm showing the amazing armature for one of the plasters in preparation for this. And then there are relatively few photos of the sculpture in situ at the festival. This is one of them, so I'm showing you it even though it's from behind. But the sculpture does still survive, and it's now at the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art in Edinburgh, where you can see it. You can see it here. And I also can't not show you this plaster version, which is one of my favorite things that I've seen by Moore as part of the planning for this exhibition. He's used strings to create texture on the surface. Those are those little lines that you can see there. And I think it makes it almost seem to vibrate with energy. I think it is just one of the most beautiful things. So any lecture on Henry Moore that left out a discussion of his contemporary Barbara Hepworth would be leaving out half the story of British sculpture in the mid-century. I mentioned her earlier. She's a little younger than Moore, but she was also from Yorkshire, from Wakefield, born in 1903. She studies at the Leeds School of Art and comes to the Royal College in London in 1921. So they're on a very similar trajectory time-wise. After a trip to Rome in the mid-1920s, she became interested in direct carving and settled in the artistic community of Hampstead again. She exhibited at a number of shows and overlapped a bit with Moore at that time. Like him, she also left London during the war, and in her case, she went quite far away to St. Ives in Cornwall. She was living in quite close proximity to the countryside and reflected in 1946, quote, "The main source of my inspiration are the human figure and the landscape, also the one in relation to the other." Hepworth was also commissioned for the Festival of Britain in 1951, her first public commissions, for which she created 2 large-scale sculptures. The first here is Turning Forms. It was a highly innovative work made of white-painted concrete on a steel armature, and it was a motor-driven kinetic sculpture, which rotated on a plate, making a full revolution every 2 minutes. And it recalled earlier constructivist kinetic sculptures, and it was very clearly an embodiment of the festival's celebration of science, technology, and industrial design. It was commissioned for the Thameside restaurant, where you can see it here, which was designed by the architect Jane Drew and located on the South Bank. And after the festival, the sculpture was moved to a school in St. Albans, north of London, but has never since revolved as it was originally intended to do. But there was a conservation treatment, I think in 2021, as part of an increased interest in Hepworth's work, and they made a digital recreation of it revolving. So I encourage you to look that up if that's of interest to you. The second work, Contrapunctual Forms, was the largest sculpture Hepworth had attempted at this time, and marked the first time she took on permanent assistance in order to carry out a commission. Carved from 2 monumental blocks of Irish blue limestone, the sculpture shows 2 separate abstract figures that were, according to Hepworth, quote, blended into one carved and rhythmic form. At the festival, Contrapunctual Forms was sited near the Dome of Discovery and Skylon on London's South Bank. And when the festival closed, the Arts Council presented the sculpture to Harlow New Town in Essex. In common with many of these new towns that were springing up after the war, Harlow Town Council acquired and commissioned many works of contemporary sculpture for its civic spaces, and Contrapunctual Forms was moved to a housing estate where it remained ever since. Moore and Hepworth were nearly perfect contemporaries and really were peers, though comparisons of their work for years has pitted them against each other, with questions often asked of who pierced the form first. Hepworth's success in the 1950s came slightly after Moore's success the decade prior, which caused critics and publics to view her as his student or protege, even though she had a robust and productive career unrelated to Moore. Museums dedicated to her work in both her hometown in Wakefield and in the site of her studio in St. Ives have created numerous exhibitions in recent years that have advanced her legacy. We'll turn back to Moore. Not long after the festival, Moore was approached to create a large-scale sculpture to sit outside the new headquarters of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, in Paris in May 1955. But it took him 2 years to decide what kind of sculpture to make. In September 1956, Moore wrote, quote, "To make a sculpture which has, if only in my mind, a real connection with the purpose of UNESCO and also proper scale, relationship, or contrast, and to be a satisfactory piece of sculpture is to me not an easy affair." And many of Moore's early ideas for the UNESCO Commission featured groups or seated figures, sometimes reading a book, in an attempt to convey something about the educational aspirations of the organization. He also experimented with the idea of creating a wall behind his sculpture, because he knew it was going to be sited in front of an architectural setting. So we saw that earlier with the MFA's bronze with the seated figure against curved wall, but he ultimately abandoned that idea. And in February 1957, so nearly 2 years after taking on the commission, he brought 4 maquettes to Paris to be judged by Marcel Breuer, the architect of the new building, and members of the organization's art committee. And every person independently selected the same work, which, as it happens, was Moore's favorite, which is here, as you can see, a reclining figure. So that theme, that design coming back into his work again and again. Once the maquette and design was decided on, just lots of extra pages here. Once the maquette was decided on, he took it to the quarry in Italy, where it was carved, and they kept the maquette there, and he would go occasionally every couple of months to check on it, and you can see him here carving it there. And we brought this sculpture out on view for the exhibition. It's from our own collection. It's the head of the reclining figure. It's quite relatively large, and we've displayed it at a bit of a height so that you can get a sense of what it might have looked like to have looked up at this sculpture. And that is on view in the exhibition. So one of the most important places for the creation of Moore's legacy was not in London or in either of his hometowns in Hertfordshire or Yorkshire, but just across the border in Canada, in Toronto. Created in 1974, the Henry Moore Sculpture Centre was created when Moore gifted the museum 101 sculptures, 57 drawings, 150 prints, which earned international headlines. It was the brainchild of Toronto architect John C. Parkin, and the center was designed with Moore's work in mind. And today, the very day that we're speaking here together, marks the 50th anniversary of the opening of the center. So it makes some sense to take a little bit of time and look at this really extraordinary gift from Moore. The city of Toronto is actually celebrating Henry Moore Day today as we speak. It's a municipal celebration. So in a way, I suppose we are as well. The AGO's collection of Henry Moore works now numbers more than 950 works, including rare plasters, bronzes, maquettes, sketchbooks. They include 78 rare plaster casts, which were near life-size models, textured with a variety of household tools and sometimes hand-covered. And Moore referred to these plasters as, quote, plaster originals. They are the actual work that has been done with one's own hands. In 1974, Moore oversaw the installation of these works personally. The heavy sculptures were placed on wheeled pedestals, allowing them to be moved easily. And former curator from the Art Gallery of Ontario, Alan G. Wilkinson, who later wrote quite a few books on Moore, would describe the process as a game of musical Moores. The final result was a breathtaking and powerful display of sculpture. Toronto's association with Moore had begun a few years prior in 1966 with his monumental bronze three-way piece number 2, Archer, which was chosen by Finnish architect Viljo Revel to accompany the new city hall being built in the center of the city. Its purchase was controversial due to the high price tag. At the time, it was 100,000 Canadian dollars, and the city refused to buy the work. But the citizens of Toronto banded together to raise the funds themselves, and the sculpture later became a symbol of the city. And Moore himself went to Toronto to install it there in Nathan Phillips Square, where I visited in December of last year with Erica, and there was a big Christmas market going on around it. So it really is a central place for civic pride in the city. For those of you that have visited the exhibition, you will likely have noticed this large plaster, which I'm showing you here in my rather blurry photo of the Sculpture Center in Toronto. This is Atom Piece, or the working model for nuclear energy. And this sculpture usually lives in Toronto and was lent very specially to us for this exhibition. It's a plaster. Those are very difficult to travel. We had some wonderful expertise from conservators, both from Toronto and from the Henry Moore Foundation, that brought it safely here to us. And so by adding this to the exhibition, we were able to include large-scale works by Moore in all of the major materials, including bronze, a variety of different stones, and plaster. And I'm showing you here this little stepped display case from Toronto that we used as inspiration for part of our studio display in Gund. And you can see just here in this little box. And here, this is the maquette for the Atom Piece, which some of you may know from its large-scale work, Nuclear Energy, which is now at the University of Chicago. The work recognizes the achievement of Italian-born American physicist Enrico Fermi, working in the converted subterranean squash court on UChicago's campus, where on December 2nd, 1942, he carried out the first controlled nuclear chain reaction that led to the atomic bomb and the development of nuclear energy. The person who commissioned this work from Moore, Professor McNeil of UChicago, asked for, quote, a statue that might bring forth the awfulness of the event. I mean awful in its proper sense, of inspiring awe, a sense of greatness, power, and danger all at once. And after the work was installed, a local newspaper pointed out in 1967 some of the challenges that the work had presented. Quote, Moore champions symbolism. Some scientists see in the atomic cloud the menace of destruction. They believe this to be the wrong interpretation to be placed on the work of Fermi. Humanists concede the militaristic aspect of the design, but point to its cathedral effect and its suggestion of a hopeful future. Thus, Henry Moore touches a sensitive nerve. And it was a challenging commission for him. And while the working model, the plaster that we have, retains the name Atom Piece, the final sculpture was titled Nuclear Energy to get away from the association between peace and world peace. in an idea of trying to emphasize more the positive rather than the destructive aspects of the scientific breakthrough. In 1976, the city of Dallas commissioned Henry Moore to create a sculpture to be placed in the plaza in front of Dallas City Hall. And Moore had been recommended to Dallas officials by I.M. Pei, the architect of the building. And Dallas Peace, as it ultimately came to be known, would be the third time that Moore and Pei collaborated. And I think we've seen a bit of a theme here of the relationship between Moore's work and architecture. He liked to work with architects. He thought a lot about what his materials would look like when against an architectural background. I think that's part of why he's always thinking about walls and about placing his sculpture in landscape. He's always thinking about the whole environmental experience of seeing something. In designing the sculpture, Moore felt that the piece would need to be massive to compete with Dallas City Hall's structure and the wide horizontal plane of the plaza. And I'm showing you here the final work, which was designed to be curved and organic, such that it contrasted with this geometric and block-like architecture. And when it was originally installed, you could walk between the pieces here, but it's been kind of cordoned off now. You can't get up to it anymore. But according to Moore, understanding his work would come with experiencing it. He positioned the pieces in this triangle to encourage you to come in. And Moore said, quote, "It's a good thing if something does not immediately tell you what it is and what it is about, because otherwise there would be nothing more to know about it. A thing should have some mystery and some unexpected things which you only find out by being in it and experiencing it." And we have the working model in the exhibition, and we talk on the label there. This is in the first gallery of the exhibition, where we're talking about the use of found objects and also the playing with scale. So while this piece is called three-piece vertebra, so it's meant to look like pieces of bones, and it's displayed in a gallery with other works inspired by bones, he wasn't actually inspired by bones in this instance. He was inspired by bits of flint, so the stone that you often see scattered along sheep fields in the English countryside. So he'd picked them up and kind of cleaved them into pieces and created this interlocking form. And then that's where the inspiration behind this sculpture came from. So a visitor to Dallas who would have been walking between these forms wouldn't really know much about the inspiration happening half the world away in the countryside of England. And I just show you here I.M. Pei and Henry Moore working together in Dallas in the late 1970s. And Moore's work was really very popular in American circles in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. His image as a humble British artist made him an appealing prospect for an American government entities and for corporations. Moore himself said, quote, "Sculpture no longer need fight for its audience. It can now be supported from America, if not at home." So he's clearly getting more support there than he was in Britain. And if this element of his work is of interest to you, I encourage you to read Pauline Rose's excellent work on Henry Moore in America, both her book noted on the handout and a great and very easily accessible short article on the Tate's online resource. That's that link at the very bottom. Rose discusses the fact that Moore's greatest market was in the United States because he had such an influential network of supporters, including people like Pei and gallerists as well, who really saw him as the quintessential Englishman, whose version of abstraction was palatable and not at all socialist. In the Cold War years, his monumental bronzes would provide civic and corporate entities with highly visible symbols of citizenship and leadership, and they were often placed in public spaces like piazzas, malls, city halls, museums, and play a role in the creation of American outdoor spaces in the second half of the 20th century. And I think that Dr. Christopher Ketchum will be discussing this aspect of Moore's work in greater detail next week during his lecture that I'm very much looking forward to on the humanity of urban spaces in post-war United States. So I thought I'd end with the final gallery of the exhibition. While the exhibition is not organized chronologically in any way, the final gallery of the exhibition has two great examples of late carvings by Moore, which perfectly sum up his lifelong commitment to the material and to materiality. If it had been early works in English stone, such as Mother and Child, that received early critical attention in relation to his practice as a direct carver, the carved work of his mid and late career was nonetheless worthy of great attention, not only to see how he approached carving and how it changed throughout his career, but in charting the persistence of the idea from the first time of his carved works as a student through to these later pieces, when he was certainly one of the most well-known and successful artists of the 20th century. And I think also we can consider the way in which the reclining figure had continued to be a key theme in his imagery throughout his life. Would it sometimes result in something quite figurative, and at times something with only a hint of the figure in it, veering very, very far into abstraction. And these two reclining figures are both by Moore, made less than 5 years apart. And I find it kind of incredible that the same mind can produce these two things from this originating point. And I think it really demonstrates the way in which Moore's mind could create such an array of forms and shapes. Moore himself said, "In my reclining figures, I have often made a sort of looming leg, the top leg in the sculpture projecting over the lower leg, which gives a sense of thrust and power, as a large branch of a tree might move outward from the main trunk. And the sharp angles and apertures lend energy to this resting form." By the final decade of his life, the 1980s, Moore was less active as a sculptor. It's a pretty physical way of art making. Works like this are firmly at the end of his career and represent the culmination of nearly 7 decades of daily dedication to material and form. The final years of his life saw him celebrated and the creation of places and spaces that help his legacy live on. The Henry Moore Sculpture Gallery and Center for the Study of Sculpture opened in Leeds in 1982 and is now known as the Henry Moore Institute. And after his life, his home became a museum and study center open to the public in the summers and is well worth a visit if you're in London. And lastly, I'd like to remind you that there's more. I'm drawing your attention to the excellent work of our colleague Nanase Shirakawa, a curatorial research associate for this project, who pulled together information on Moore's and O'Keeffe's in public collections in New England. And she wrote a really excellent article on our website about finding Henry Moore in Boston, which will certainly encourage you to go across the river to Cambridge to see 3 there, 2 at MIT and 1 at Harvard, though they do bundle them up for the winter. They have these little coats that they put on them, so I encourage you to get over there in the next couple of weeks or go back in the spring. And then I also encourage you to go slightly further afield to Lincoln, to the wonderful historic New England house, Gropius House, where you'll be rewarded by the glimpse of a teeny tiny Moore work in the living room there, which if you visited that house, I doubt you've noticed it, but we made a special pilgrimage to see it there together last spring. And just in conclusion, I hope that all of you have gotten to know Moore a bit better through this study of his life and work. I have really enjoyed getting to know him myself over the past year, and I think that the works that we have on view in the gallery show off the full range of his artistic production, from his deep dedication to drawings to sculpture in so many different materials. And I was speaking with Paige before this lecture about the massive variety in scale, from things only 2 inches tall to something that towers over you, and I think Moore really could do it all. I'm happy to take any questions. I think there are microphones, but thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you for the lecture. From the exhibition downstairs, I think many of us are struck by the parallel influence of natural forms that influence both of them. Were they ever aware of this mutual enforcement themselves? Did they ever meet? Did they ever correspond? We
think it's possible, though not necessarily likely, that they could have met at the opening of Moore's exhibition at MoMA in 1946. It was in New York. O'Keeffe was living there, but I think Stieglitz had her husband, Alfred Stieglitz, had just died, so she maybe wasn't really attending exhibition openings at MoMA. O'Keeffe certainly would have known Moore. and more probably knew O'Keeffe by the later years. I mean, he was so famous. There would have been no way of avoiding him, really, I think. But we don't have any evidence that they corresponded. They didn't have books about each other in their libraries. It really, truly is an uncanny thing that they are doing the same thing across an ocean apart. And I think the exhibition really demonstrates that sort of rhythmic, the way their works sing together well. Anything else?
Do you mind passing that over? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your lecture. That was awesome. It seems like he worked with so many materials and mediums. Is there one material that he particularly gravitated toward in his work, and why do you think that is?
I think for him, everything really comes back to something that's manipulable. So he liked working in plaster. That whole studio is really for making these plaster pieces, which are the starting point. That was the way that he could work in small scale and make something that was really knowable. He also, and this is something I learned from the folks at the Henry Moore Foundation, he liked to sometimes work in styrofoam. Because he could kind of cut away at it and carve at it and put armatures in it. And he could also carry it around with him. He really liked to move things around. So he would there are these photos of him carrying what looked like large-scale sculptures, really heavy things underneath his arm, but they're actually styrofoam. So he liked anything that was movable. He liked things that he could really manipulate. I think he really liked to get sort of dirty with it. You can, in the video that we have in the exhibition, he's really kind of very playful and leaving a lot of things to chance. His best known works obviously are the bronze ones, and I think in some ways the most special ones are the carvings because they have that directness of touch, but I think the plasters really were where it all started, and that's where his final works come to fruition, through the plasters.
Hi, I was wondering how he determined what type of material to use for the end product after he was tinkering in plaster.
Once he's receiving commissions, I think from the 40s, 50s onwards, he's really at the mercy of whoever's commissioning it. And so anything that was going to be outside probably would be bronze. We saw with the festival work, he considered a carving, but then when he found out it was going to be an outside setting, he switched over to bronze because that's so much more durable. And I think he was really trying to decide what would work best for the commission. If I'm thinking, for instance, about the UNESCO one, the travertine, thinking maybe about the legacy of marble and trying to tie into a string of artists through time. And that was being cited against quite a dark building, so he wanted a light thing that would create a contrast. And a lot of his works play with architecture in that way. So I think it was part of an entire environment consideration.
I was particularly curious about the concrete.
Oh, the concrete, yes. That's not a major part of it. That's really a kind of experimentation in the 20s and 30s. There's not very many works by him in concrete, though you saw Hepworth working in concrete too. I think it was a kind of new material for artists to be using, so anyone who had a creative mind would want to experiment in that material and see what was happening with it. I don't think it ultimately, you couldn't get very much detail. It ends up being quite soft, and I don't think that you could convey as much through it, so he didn't tend to use it after that period.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. Could you comment on Moore's political attitudes and their implications in his work, if any?
So I alluded to that a little bit. I think he's seen as someone who's not particularly controversial as an artist. Is certainly an artist working in abstraction. He's kind of palatable as someone doing abstraction that you can then put him in front of your city hall and you're not really making a political statement. He was a member of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, which is interesting thinking about that in relation to the nuclear energy piece. He declined a knighthood, so I think he maybe didn't feel that he agreed with the general trend of politics in Britain in the mid-20th century, but he didn't really act too much politically. But I do think if you'd really like to learn a bit more about how his work was received through a political lens, not really of his own volition, I really encourage you to read Pauline Rose's work. She gets into a lot of what why corporations in particular in America gravitated towards him in particular.
Thank you. So you alluded at the beginning to his African mask type works, and those seem to disappear. And do you have anything more to say about that?
It's such a long career, I didn't get too much into his many, many influences, but he had many books and works of art in his home, Cycladic sculpture, African masks. He was really interested in pre-Columbian Mexican material, a particular kind of reclining figure called the chacmul figure. It's sort of leaning back on its arms. He was, as I said, omnivorous. He liked everything, and he wanted to draw from as many sources as possible. And I think as a student in those early years in the 20s, he's kind of soaking everything up. And then after that, he finds his rhythm. He also finds what's working. And I think that there's a certain style that certainly patrons enjoyed. But there's a little bit about his influence in the exhibition, particularly about the reclining figures. Anyone else? Great. Well, thank you so much for being here. Okay.